Hi, this is Terry from Bonsai Tree. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be demonstrating the repotting of this Japanese black pine. It is a customer's tree of mine, and it has a couple of issues which I have found to be fairly common amongst black pines that I see locally grown in the Western Cape. And also, so I want to address some of those, and then also want to show you a technique of repotting a conifer like this, going from one growing medium into a completely different growing medium. One of the issues that I need to address is when this tree was repotted into this bigger container, the one that it's in now, it was simply slip potted. You can still see the outline of the old root or old soil mass, simply put up, a little bit of soil put around it. So that's what one would call, or what you would call, slip potting. Very dangerous thing to do, well, for a number of reasons. One of them being that this older root mass is likely to have compacted, and oxygen and water is going to find it difficult to penetrate this old root system or old soil base. And therefore you're going to get a tremendous amount of root, or if there's any root development, it's going to happen around the edges of the container. And although that's good, the problem is that the interior of the tree is dying out, which makes subsequent repotting that much more difficult. One of the other results of not removing old soil when you do repot a pine is that the tree eventually starts looking like it's almost rising out of the container. So the root ball becomes more and more exposed because you're only able to remove a certain amount of roots at the end because the roots on the interior have all died out. So it's a very dangerous position for a tree to be in like this. But as I said, the problem just becomes compounded further and further with time, the more that this bad or poor technique for repotting is practiced. The first thing that I'm going to be doing is to use a sickle to just create a small gap or groove around the container, which will make it easier to remove the tree. The next step is going to be to lift it or remove it from the container. We can just lift it out, and we can also confirm that the tree is okay to be repotted now, because you can see the white new tips of the roots that are developing. We can also check the root system for mycorrhiza, which is also an indication of the health of the soil. There is a little bit of mycorrhiza in some of the areas, but very, very little. So I would think that this soil, given that it is very organic soil, is probably too water retentive, and it's not an environment that is conducive to the development of mycorrhiza. If you want to be sure whether your timing of your repotting is good, is if you look at the candles, and you can see they're starting to develop. This is actually quite far along already. You could have done the repotting maybe 2-3 weeks ago already, but the window for repotting black pines is fairly broad, so it doesn't have to be exact, but you want to catch it before the needles on these candles actually start developing. They are just starting now, so it's still fine to do the repot, but that's one of the things that you would look out for as an indicator that it's safe to go ahead. Before I carry on any further, I should actually run through the reasons very quickly as to why I want to repot this tree, aside from the fact that the customer asked me to repot it. You know, when you're looking at, one shouldn't firstly be repotting your trees based on a calendar schedule every 2 years or whatever the case may be. It's better to look at what the tree is doing or not doing as an indicator of of the necessity to repot. So you would look for things like water, the drainage capacity, how well the soil drains when you do water it. If the soil is compacted very much, or perhaps the container become completely full of roots and water is unable to really penetrate and drain out the drainage holes, that is something that you would then use as a possibility or a possible reason to justify repotting. But sometimes what happens is that, especially depending on the growing medium that you're using, but I found a lot with akadama based mixes that you will get a lot of surface root forming, which is of course a great thing, but what it does is it impedes the drainage, the water as well as oxygen from getting into the soil. And then instead of having to do a full repot, what is a good solution, quick and easy solution, is really just to scrape off the top centimeter or 2 centimeters until you start seeing the whole particles of akadama and pumice again. So rake that all off. So you're raking away that fine surface root, and then you replace or fill back what you've removed with fresh soil. And then, so a full repot is not necessary. Other reasons that you might want to repot is that, for instance, this tree is growing in a very organic mix, and so it's retaining a lot of water, which is not ideal for a pine. And this customer needs to still practice their watering a little bit. And so it's better to have something that doesn't retain as much water, which will allow the soil to dry out a little bit more before they would be re-watering again. That of course will help for excessive watering, but the problem still remains of during winter, if you have a lot of, or depending on when your rainy season is, but ours in the Western Cape of South Africa is in the winter months. That is when we have our rain. So it's cold and it's very rainy. So now you're going to have this tree's root system sitting in a very wet growing medium for weeks and weeks on end. So we want to get it into good soil, and also because all of these other trees have now been repotted into an akadama-based mix. And so we would like to get this tree into the same mix because it would make watering that much easier. It's very difficult if you have many trees and each one is in a different growing medium or a different ratio of the growing mediums, just because it's easier to do that. And then you're going to find that you're going to have to give this one a little bit more water, a little bit less water. And you're going to have you're making a lot of work for yourself. You do want to try and simplify that, and also you can't make watering a full-time job. So you need to look at simplifying your watering regime as much as possible. And in fact, your choice of growing media can play a role in that. You don't want to have a whole lot of different mixes out there. If you do, that might be fine as a start. That's good as a starting point, but you will find that over time you might alter your mixes slightly. So if you need a wetter mix, you might add more akadama, and if you need a drier mix, you might add more pumice, so that when you do go out and water, that you can water all your trees at the same time. But if you have very organic mixes, you have leca and peat-based mixes like the professional mix, or if you have an akadama, pumice, lava-based mix, and then you have different ratios of that. Now you have a whole plethora of different mixes that with different trees, all at different stages of development. It's really going to be very difficult for you to, and the tendency is going to be to want to water everything at the same time, and then that's not necessarily going to cater to the individual tree's needs best. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is to just rake off this old soil, and I'm using a 2-prong rake. You can use a rake of any kind really, but I find that the root rakes with multiple prongs are more inclined to rip roots. So we're just going to remove some soil at first, and then going to change the technique slightly. The next part of the technique is that, which is actually a technique that has been, I think, developed and by Boone, and I'm going to try and pronounce his surname, Boone Manikipavit. If I have just butchered it, I do apologize, Boone. But he suggests when you have a tree like this, which is in a totally different medium, that you instead of bare rooting the entire root ball in one go, he suggests doing a 50-50 approach. So in this case, we would leave the entire back section of the root ball untouched, and in the front we would clean out the front 50%. And this will ensure that the roots are undisturbed at the back, so they can continue feeding and functioning as normal, and the front is now going to be exposed, but then with the new media, new roots can issue in there, and then in 2 years' time you go back and you remove the soil at the back of the tree and you leave the front untouched. So it's a systematic approach of repotting. So you don't do it all at once, and that will reduce the amount of stress that is placed on the tree. The next step is to reduce the roots, and you will see that as a result of the growing medium that was used, there are some very coarse roots, especially on the interior. And so to revitalize, we need to prune those thicker roots back to try to increase the amount of fine feeder roots that we have on the root ball. Don't use the same pair of scissors on the roots as you would normally use on the rest of a tree. Rather use something that's dedicated to that, and then also using root cutters as well. I've selected this oval unglazed container from the Yokkaichi range that's available on the website. Why I selected an unglazed pot specifically is because it does lose more water. Glazed pots retain more water because of the glaze on the outside of the container. This one will lose more water, and therefore it will help the soil to dry out a little bit faster. The container is oval, and I chose that because it's a less formal container. It's not the final container for the tree, it's still a training container, but you don't want to use a container that is too big. It's just a waste of soil, a waste of water, a waste of fertilizer. And also, if a container is too large, then what happens is that the tree doesn't actually utilize the water from the soil fast enough, so that the soil is constantly staying wet. So you want to try and use a container that will allow sufficient growth for the coming years until you do need to repot. So it needs to be big enough to allow that growth. So you don't want to stifle it. But you also don't want the container to be too big that the tree essentially would kind of drown in that size container. The next step will be to prepare the container to pot into, and in order to do that, we are going to cut some mesh to cover the drainage holes so that the growing media doesn't fall out. And then we need to use some wire, aluminium wire, to make some bunny ears, and that will ensure that the mesh does not move in the container, and when you put the soil in, and then at the same time you lose your soil through the drainage holes. and the mesh should not be able to move. And then I'm going to use some more wire in order to tie the tree down. When a tree has just been repotted now, there is a possibility that it could be bumped, could fall out of the container, or simply if you've got any movement that can be attributed to wind, a little breeze, and if there's any movement in the tree, any new roots, roots are very tender when they're very young, and those roots will break off. And if enough of it breaks off, or if it happens repeatedly, you could lose the tree. And now this container doesn't have wire holes in it, although you could drill them in. I'm not going to do that. All I'm going to do is just secure 2 strands of wire across through the drainage holes. It's not the best, but it will secure the tree sufficiently that I wouldn't be concerned about movement. Just put those through, and bending the wire like this just makes sure that where it makes the bend through the drainage hole, that it's nice and sharp, so that the wire can lay perfectly flat against the underside of the container. And now we're ready now to put soil in. I'm going to be using some Kobayashi blend, which is mainly akadama, baked akadama, and then the normal air-dried akadama, and then quite a number of other components as well. So we're just going to put a bit of soil in first, and you generally would mound it up towards the center, and then when you place your tree on top, you wiggle it down onto the soil. When tightening the tie-down wires, it's important that you pull and then twist. Otherwise, the aluminium wire, if just twisted, is going to snap. And as you can see, there's no movement in the tree. And that's what you want. You don't want the tree to be able to rock around inside the container. That's just a recipe for failure, especially if you live in a slightly windy area, but even if you just have breezes. And then the next step is to fill up the container with a growing medium. And well, you don't want to fill it up, you want to fill it up in stages, because you now need to use a chopstick or some other implement just to work the soil into all the cavities so that you've got no open spaces. Roots won't develop in those areas, so you need to make sure that you fill those spaces up. And that is the repotting completed. The next step will be to water it well. It's quite important when you water for the first time to water very thoroughly until the water that's running out of the drainage holes runs out clear. Then you know that any dust, any akadama dust, has been washed out. I've completed the repotting now of this tree, and now it will be kept in a protected position. So it'll still be given as much light as possible, although probably restricted to morning sun at the moment, or at first, but definitely kept from as much wind as possible. And then when I see good development in the tree, or as I see it responding or carrying on growing, then I will move it into more sunlight. Decandling will most likely not be performed on this particular tree because it has been repotted. But I, again, will see how good the response, how strong the tree is. I didn't have any top dressing made up. I've been doing a lot of repotting, and I forgot that I didn't have any more prepared. So I will still prepare some and put that on at a later stage in the next couple of days. But for now, it's fine to go out onto the bench. No fertilizer necessary for at least a few weeks. And then I can start fertilizing it weekly and increase it as the summer progresses. I hope that you've learned something or picked up a few tips that you can use yourself with your bonsai trees. Thanks very much for watching, and please do like and subscribe so that you'll be notified when more videos are posted. And please feel free to leave some comments below, and I'll try and answer you as soon as possible. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.